Welcome back to Risky Business, a show about making better decisions. I'm Maria Konnikova.
And I'm Nate Silver. On October 21st, the NBA season will be back. One team will end the year with a dark cloud hanging over it. Have you heard of the company Aspiration?
I heard of it when preparing for this segment. So that's what we're going to start the show off with. And then we're going to talk about a very important question, which is, does New York City need more millionaires? But billionaires too. I think, does New York City need more very wealthy people? All right, Nate, let us start with your wheelhouse, which is the NBA and the Clippers. So do you want to get us set up here, since this is something that you know a lot more about, at least background wise, than I do?
Yeah, so the NBA has a salary cap. It's kind of an attempt to prevent owners, many of whom are extremely rich. In fact, one of whom is the principal here, Steve Ballmer, owner of the Clippers, the Microsoft guy, one of the, I think, 6 to 10 richest people in the world. But it's a way in part to protect these guys who are very competitive and basically have infinite amounts of money from spending irrational amounts to have their toys be cooler when they're in the box and their team makes a deep run in the finals or wins a championship. The league set these rules, and increasingly in the NBA, these rules are getting pretty strict, and the idea of circumventing the rules is taken very seriously. Several weeks ago, the journalist Pablo Torre, journalist, kind of, people might call him a talking head, but he also has a show where he does, at times, very serious journalism, and discovered that this fraudulent carbon credit company, allegedly fraudulent carbon credit company called Aspiration, which had been a sponsor for the
It's a
Clippers.
great name for a fraudulent company, by the way, Nate. Aspiration.
But basically, it turns out that this fake tree planting company, Aspiration, was paying the Clippers Kawhi Leonard, probably their best player. Some Ivica Zubac stands might disagree, but their most famous player, right? Multiple-time NBA champion, was paying him $7 million a year to do literally nothing for them, right? For anybody who scoured this, right? He could have tweeted something or done one little ad that got 100 views on YouTube that showed him like planting trees or something. He did not do any of that, right? There's also been disclosures by other news outlets that Kawhi Leonard received $20 million in equity in Aspiration, which is now worth precisely zero, to be fair. But a total package of like $48 million in cash and equity. And Steve Ballmer made a $50 million investment in Aspiration, who are the official sponsor of the Clippers, right? So that set of circumstances alone is pretty suspicious. Pablo Torre also had an anonymized source, somebody who went through the kind of vocal processing that gave him like a very millennial vocal fry, say that this company's going bankrupt, right? And they actually hire legitimately famous people, and the famous people are getting paid way too much to actually do something for the company. Robert Downey Jr. was one, for example, gravelly voiced ad, right? Kawhi was getting paid $7 million to totally ghost this company, right? When people ask, why is this bankrupt company paying this guy who has done nothing at all for us? Nobody even knows he's in a relationship with us, $7 million a year. People would say things like, it's cap circumvention, LOL, in text messages, right? The theory is that Steve Ballmer, well, let me back up. I'll be vaguer. The claim is that the Clippers found a way through this company Aspiration that their owner is also an equity investor in, to pay Kawhi Leonard a bunch of extra money so he'd sign in LA with the Clippers and not the Lakers, or not stay in Toronto or back to San Antonio or the Houston Rockets or whatever else. And if you're into NBA gossip, Maria, this story, at what's normally a slow time for the league, has been the hot dish. Is that a real thing? I don't use those terms. Hot dish is like a Minnesota thing. I don't think it's a real term. I think I fucked that up.
It's okay. It's okay. We'll
The
we'll
hot
pretend.
dish.
We'll make it. We'll
That's what
make
like
it a
Amy
thing, Nate.
Klobuchar brings to the Minnesota State Fair. I don't think that's
It's so funny. So when I started researching this, because, this is not in my wheelhouse, the first thing I thought about was mob stuff, and specifically on The Sopranos, where they had these contracts where they had no-show jobs, right? And you were guaranteed a certain number of no-show jobs where like that was just a way of getting kickback, getting money around, and people no-showed, right? And when I was reading this, I was like, wait, they're taking a page out of the mob playbook to try to circumvent caps and get money to the right person, in a kind of kickbacky way, without actually having a paper trail, although this time they did have a paper trail. There's always a paper trail, right? But that's the first thing I thought about. I was like, wow, this is like a very mobby type of thing. And then it also reminded me, do you remember back this summer, or maybe even earlier, and we mentioned it, I think, briefly on the show, there was a probe in Las Vegas, which, when you think mob and no-show jobs, Vegas is certainly top of mind as well. When the Aces were getting $100,000 sponsorships from the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Authority. I think we talked about that, right? To try to get around those salary caps. So it seems like this is a tactic that's been gaining steam. And so to me, it's just very interesting. If we talk about it from kind of a risky business game theory angle, is this the natural devolution of salary caps and of trying to curb some sort of behavior where people end up going around it, right? And trying to figure out, well, I still really want this player, or I really want this person to come, to the Clippers. I really want this person on the Aces, whatever it is. So let's figure out how we make it happen, and try not to run afoul of the letter of the law, while just totally disregarding the spirit of the law.
well, except it clearly violate. I mean, the NBA Constitution is not the U.S. Constitution, right? There are quite a lot of provisions that pertain to the anticipation of this type of activity, right? If you've watched the Pablo Torre show, he has thousands of pages of documents printed out. It gave me flashback to when I was on debate team going to copy shit at Kinko's late at night. But
Good old Kinko's.
the Constitution basically says that we can rely on sufficiently compelling circumstantial evidence if there is, I think it might actually use the term circumstantial because it's not a legal standard, right? And if there is no rational explanation for what happened apart from the fact that it was cap circumvention, right? There's no rational explanation that I've seen offered. Well, let me take that back slightly, right? There's not really a rational reason for the value produced to Aspiration to pay Kawhi $28 million over 4 years and $20 million in equity to do nothing, right? I'm sure he's a smart guy. I don't think he was providing good advice to the board or anything either. And if he was, then the board, not a very successful venture by Kawhi, right? Now, that, however, goes to an arbitrator, right? So the league is going to have its findings. They hired some 3 or 4 name white shoe law firm. They will come back with a report. Not anytime soon, by the way, probably in 6 months, if not longer. And then it goes to arbitration.
And by the way, and what happens in the meantime while it's being deliberated and arbitrated? Are there any consequences? Are there any suspensions? Is there anything like that? Or does life just go on as usual while all of this is happening?
Well, the Clippers are a team that is kind of at a crossroads, right? They were pretty good last year, lost in 7 games to the Denver Nuggets, who were a better team, but they're in the upper half of NBA teams. They're also older, spent a lot of money this year on veteran players, right? Don't have that many draft picks going forward, but one punishment. So Joe Smith was a Minnesota Timberwolves player back in the day that the team had a sweetheart deal with to say, hey, look, we can only afford to give you this much now, but we'll take care of you on the back end, right? And this somehow came out, I think, in whether it was bankruptcy proceedings or so. By the way, a lot of the stuff that comes out, it comes out because somebody fucks up and there's discovery. And a lot of things where you get in legal trouble, all of a sudden these things that no one ever believed would be public become public. But the Timberwolves were fined 5 draft picks. People were suspended. Ownership was suspended for like a year, right? The Clippers barely even have 5 draft picks. If I were them, I would fucking trade my draft picks while I still could. You want to take my draft picks? Sorry, we don't have them anymore. We traded them for player talent.
So thinking ahead in this game, if you think you're going to get fined and you're going to be penalized, that would definitely be the thing to do. And the funny thing is, in the case of the Aces, like, there's a good case to be made that there was good reason for the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Authority to give them money, because they're bringing people to Vegas, right? And they're bringing visitors, and it's actually something that's mutually beneficial. And as you say, Nate, like, the dude could have tweeted once or made one statement that went out to a few hundred people to at least pretend. I think even on The Sopranos, the no-show guys sometimes came to work to just wave and say, "Hey, yes, here I am," and then just to make a show of it. And here we had none of that. What do we think is the probability of the Clippers actually getting fined in a significant way, in a way that's not a wrist slap, but something that is actually deters future behavior like this on the part of the Clippers and other teams?
Yeah, let me say I would give an 80 to 90% probability that somebody with the Clippers, maybe not Steve Ballmer, maybe Steve Ballmer didn't know that much, right? My Bayesian prior is an 89% chance that, like, this was intended by somebody who works for the Los Angeles Clippers, working with someone or some things who are working for Aspiration to circumvent the salary cap, right? That 80 to 90% might include scenarios where Kawhi himself doesn't know about it. He was known, his representation was known to be asking around for all types of things that are against the league charter, that are way outside the lines, right? So, they have been investigated for that before, right? But, I think the true chance that, like, the other explanations would be, like, maybe somehow that if you give money to Kawhi, that's kind of just transferred to somebody else, then you get money on your balance sheet, and having money in your balance sheet makes your financial statements look better if you're getting other investors, right? So ironically, because this company was allegedly so shady, we're drawing to a gut shot, I think, right? Now, will the NBA want to pursue a death penalty 5 draft pick type of situation, right? Like, that's kind of more of a political question. I think the league constitution gives Adam Silver, no relation, a fair amount of wiggle room, right? The other owners aren't happy about this, in part because, like, the Clippers already spend as much money as anybody in the league. They built one of the most expensive basketball arenas, the Intuit Dome, ever built, and people are already concerned about this, right? And so, like, they might want punishment, but, like, there are actually 3 things the league could do. Adam Silver could say, we have found that we believe that, salary cap circumvention was committed, and now we're going to go to arbitration for a ruling, right? They could say, this does not meet our threshold for punishment. It was bad. Does not meet our definition of cap circumvention beyond an extent to which we can prove, right? We're going to take away a second round draft pick and fine Steve Ballmer $5 million, which to him is like a parking ticket, kind of literally, if you do the math, right? And call it a day, right? And then the third scenario is like a plea bargain, right? Where they say, we don't want to have to take this to arbitration. We want this to last another 2 years, right? So we think we could get 3 draft picks and voiding Kawhi's contract and suspending Steve Ballmer for a year. But instead, sorry, Steve, 6-month suspension, 2 draft picks, maybe one of which you can get back for good behavior. The largest fines, because you'll pay the money. That's good for both of us, because you don't care about the money, and the other owners will be pacified, right? If I had to guess, right, I'd say that, like, 20% chance slap on the wrist, 40% chance plea bargain, 40% chance that the league wants to come down pretty hard and it goes to arbitration, conditional on that 80% chance the arbitrators agree. So the odds of, like, the nuclear option happening, I think, are lower than the odds of something happening, which in turn are lower than something actually having happened, because, like, if it's borderline, then I think you get into slap on the wrist territory.
Yeah, and I think that the other part of this is what do they want? Like, if they're looking in the future, right? What do they want to see happen?
Right.
Because all of those different scenarios reward, we talk a lot on the show about how game theory is all about, incentivizing different types of behaviors, right? And that happens both with rewards and with punishments. The three scenarios, Nate, that you've laid out spell out very different kind of futures that the league might see and might be signaling that they want to see, right? Because if you get like a slap on the wrist, they're saying, we don't actually care that much about this kind of stuff. Keep on doing it.
And this is why, like you or I, right, who play competitive games or follow competitive sports, right, we have a very efficient market. If you do not enforce your rules, I guarantee you that there's not going to be some gentleman's agreement not to violate them, that you will have a bigger problem, right? It's just it's guaranteed. That's how an equilibrium works in an efficient market, and the NBA is a reasonable approximation of an efficient market, right? And I think Adam Silver is smart enough to know that, right? I mean, look, the other defense I've heard prominently by Mark Cuban, former Dallas Mavericks owner, another smart, accomplished guy, has been a big defender of Ballmer. His defense is Steve Ballmer couldn't do something this stupid. To which I say, have you ever fucking met a billionaire before? Like the billionaire, I haven't met Elon Musk, right? Who was until recently advising the president of the United States. And I think I have a high opinion about some aspects of Elon Musk, but I also have the opinion that Elon Musk would be one example of how billionaires can believe in wrong and things and be sloppy and be very arrogant. And I think arguably also maybe it's rational for him to say, okay, we didn't expect this company to be fraudulent, right? And to have all this discovery that uncover these under the table relationships, right? And okay, what's the worst case? They're not going to take away the team. They're not going to take away the team. So maybe you have a 20% chance of discovery times a 50% chance conditionally that you get punished for it, right? So a 10% chance that you get suspended for a year, and yeah, you'll lose some draft picks. The Clippers are pretty fucked anyway, right? When you don't have many of your draft picks, removing the remaining few, I mean, he can just sell them and go buy a soccer team or WNBA team or whatever else, right? So it might be quite rational, even given the possibility, but not the certainty of this harsh punishment. I mean, isn't all the literature that it's the certainty of punishment, not the severity, that actually deters crime? Maybe it's actually wrong.
I mean, it's both. It's both, but the certainty is definitely quite important. And I think, the hilarious thing of the calculus that you've just laid out is it's one of these oh shit, I didn't realize that my crooked dealings would come out because the company that I'm using has even bigger crooked dealings, right? We didn't realize that wasn't part of the calculus. We thought the company was more legit, which is quite amusing, right? When you're doing something wrong and it turns out that you get punished because the person that you're, or the entity that you're partnering with did something even more wrong. So
and there are other Kawhi Leonard always gets hurt in the playoffs, right? If you removed his salary from their books, they might not mind that so much. You know what I mean? There's all types of perverse incentives, and arguably, if you're not willing to say Steve Ballmer, you have to sell the team, or we're moving the team to Seattle, even though he just built this new arena, the Lakers can move in there instead, right? How pissed would he be then, right? That would create a real deterrent, but
no, people need real deterrence.
And I think the NBA understands this, although Adam Silver is not the draconian ruler that former Commissioner David Stern was necessarily. The other thing about billionaires, they could just be sloppy, right? They
can afford it.
And they're smart enough to know that, this is partly why the league, partly in the Constitution, says that, we have to look at circumstantial evidence, right? Because, you don't do this in an email, you do this in a phone call, or better than a phone call, you do it in a meeting over coffee at some lemonade at the country club, right? And you have the conversations there, and then you hire a middleman who might have slightly more fingerprints on it, right? Or you're kind of informed, you tell somebody, hey, do you have any, know anybody who could maybe help Kawhi get some sponsorships, right? Or maybe go a little step further and say, you know what, anything within the within the higher end of market value, you know what I mean? Like if you instructed somebody to do that, they would kind of get the right impression. If you're a billionaire caterer, I imagine you're quite good at like taking the implicit instructions from your billionaire so as not to create legal liability for them.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is the one thing that they did not take from the mob playbook. They got the no-shows correct, but the one thing the mob always knew is that someone is always listening, someone's always watching. Watch it and don't leave a paper trail and never communicate things on, landlines or things that might be tapped, and try to hold meetings while walking outside, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that billionaires forget that and do get sloppy because they think they can afford to be. And so you do need to have punishments that are larger, kind of a magnitude larger, in order to deter that kind of behavior. And it's very interesting to me to see this playing out in a realm that I know very little about, and it turns out that it has all these parallels with realms I know a lot about, because billionaire behavior turns out to be pretty similar across the board, with thinking you can get away with shit and skirt the rules. And you know what? Usually you can. So on that note, Nate, do you want to take a break and talk about whether New York needs more of them? Do we need more millionaires? Do we need more billionaires in the state? There has been a report that recently came out by the Citizens Budget Commission that argues that New York needs more millionaires because it's been adding millionaires at a lower rate than that of other larger states. And what that means is that the state is not getting as much in tax revenue. So there's this, theoretical, unrealized potential revenue that it could be getting if millionaires were coming to New York at comparable rates to other states, and instead it is not. And we see increases in Florida. We see increases in Texas. We even are seeing increases in California, which has, some would say, even more punitive kind of tax rules than New York does. But for some reason, they're adding millionaires at a much faster rate than New York is. So in between 2010 and 2022, the New York millionaire population has almost doubled, but in the other states, it's more than tripled. And so the argument of this report is that, we should have more rich people so that they can pay more taxes. First of all, Nate, this is obviously where we've talked about Mamdani, affordability, we're getting to elections. It's interesting timing for the report to come out. But what do we think? What do you just think in general about this argument that, oh, shit, you're not keeping up with the Joneses, right? You're not keeping up with other states in terms of the rate of millionaire acquisition as a metric.
It's only doubled. I guess it's a little surprising. I don't know.
A little less than doubled in over 12 years, yeah.
Do you know where they're going? Are they going to Florida or New Jersey?
So they're going. I don't know where the New York ones are going. What we know is that it's been compared. So the three states that are having larger increases are Florida, Texas, and California.
Look, the New York tax code is fairly punitive to high earners, and there's a New York City tax on top of that. So your effective tax rate is over 50% if you're earning ordinary income as a high earner in New York City, right? Are you familiar with like the Laffer curve? This is kind of Reaganomics, right?
Yeah, talk about the Laffer curve.
So Art Laffer was a Reagan economist who drew a curve and said, well, there is some optimal tax rate where you maximize government revenue, but it is an inverted U, because at some point, like if you tax every dollar 100%, then nobody works because there's no incentive to work because the government gets all the money anyway, right? So there is some optimal tax rate, and there are all these debates about how to quantify like where that optimal tax rate might be. It's possible. And by the way, even if you're not on the other side, so if you're on the wrong side of the Laffer curve, then you actually make less money by taxing people more because people work less and or relocate, right? Even if you're not in the upper part of the Laffer curve, right? Or at the peak, right? Then you do still encounter diminishing returns. You can imagine like a parabola, right? I think New York City still offers a pretty unique. I mean, I'll be frank, right? Like I choose to live here and I pay a lot of taxes, and I also have a home in Westchester County where I pay a lot of taxes, right? Because like I really like New York, right? And there's not any particularly close second. Progressives need to understand that like you do encounter diminishing returns when you just tax rich people more and more. They can decide to work less. They can decide to, especially with Trump having gutted the IRS, right? They can decide to legally hide income or illegally hide income, right? They can decide to move, right? And so
Yep.
there are these issues that you have, and like when you start to have, you know, if they feel as though that they're not getting their money's worth, if they feel like the quality of New York City is declining, right? Like I don't know, like you know, if we had the crime problems in New York City that they have in some other cities, then I'm not super sensitive to crime. But then I might leave, right? Then you know,
Right. Sure.
if they hadn't rebuilt LaGuardia Airport, if the subway weren't, I think, still one of the best transportation systems in the world, if we didn't have so many, you know,
We have the
beautiful,
best rats, Nate. We have the
the best,
best
yeah,
rats.
we have a lot of trash cans. We figured that out, right? If we didn't have these beautiful parks in all five boroughs and things
Yep.
like that, right? If we didn't have those things, then I might say fuck it. And you know, you do have to worry potentially about like downward spirals where, but like it's just hard for me to like, you know, again, I'm kind of a free market guy, right? I also recognize that as an empirical fact, wealthy people have a disproportionate amount of influence in politics. So it's hard to, you know, I think it'd be great if New York had more billionaires. My guess is that the current tax code is probably something close to optimal for the overall welfare of the city. If you tried to increase it more, I could see there being problems. I mean, I think, you know, I have friends who are wealthy. I should say, you know, I'm pretty wealthy myself relative to a lot of people. Um, and some of them I think seem irrationally concerned about Zoran because like tax policy in New York is largely dictated by New York State anyway, and there are lots of political and practical constraints and other things, right? But like it's not. I'll put it like this: it's even as a free market guy and a guy who pays a lot of taxes in New York, maybe a member of the class even. This is not the most sympathetic cause, I don't think.
Yeah, no, I agree with you that it's definitely not the most sympathetic cause. By the way, I'm just looking at more data from this report, and their contention is that if New York City's rate of millionaires, had kept up with that in Texas, Florida, California, that would have been 13 billion in additional taxes in 2022, which is the most recent year of data. So that's kind of where they're coming from numbers wise. But you know, it is like it's not a zero sum game necessarily, as you say. A lot of the migration, because this is something that you just asked about, Nate, like, well, you know, where are they going? That a lot of the families that are leaving are actually not millionaires. They're kind of the middle, at least for New York, middle class families. For other parts of the country, they would be considered, I think, upper middle class. Those that kind of make 200, 300,000. That's the demographic that's leaving the fastest. That's the biggest outflow because you're actually pricing out people at a different price point, and they think that you are making the city less affordable, so they're leaving, and that in turn does mean less tax revenue. Because there are some data that show that, as you were alluding to, we might be at a pretty optimal point because a lot of millionaires are not that sensitive to like a marginal few percent tax rate, if they're living where
Well,
they
and
want to live, because they want to live where they want to live, right? Like that's part of the point of being a millionaire, that you want to live in a place where you're happy.
no, and what the economists call superstar effects, right? Which like it originally pertains to entertainers. I think there probably are some cases where it can apply to something like a hedge fund manager too, right? Where they attract the most talent and they get more larger funds to invest with, right? Or an AI researcher, those are more in California than in New York, right? But you know, New York is kind of irreplaceable, I think. And, you know, in fact, I think kind of California is struggling more in some ways. I think you hear that San Francisco is like rebounding a little bit, but like, since COVID, I haven't heard nearly as much LA West Coast jealousy from New Yorkers, right? I'd like to see more housing at all levels of the ecosystem, right? I'd like to see more of that, right? But like, if you don't like it, then leave. And they don't, by and large, leave because New York still offers, a high and improving, I feel like, value proposition.
I agree with you that New York is still, despite everything, a good value proposition. And for a certain type of person, there is no other replacement. So I think that, my takeaway is that this is misplaced, right? Saying, oh, we don't have enough millionaires. I think that we'd be better served looking at some other areas where we can improve in order to kind of just get a better experience for everyone in the city, and that the millionaires are not going anywhere, at least for now. That we're not at that point.
The one thing I'll say is these things can have cascading effects, at least in principle. So like, I said I would never leave New York in the near future. I have like lots of social ties here. If half my friends left New York for Denver, that might be a different story. And likewise, if you have a vicious circle where there's less tax revenue coming in, so things I like about New York, the parks and the overly expensive but now quite nice airports and the slightly dirty but very efficient subway and everything else, right? If those things deteriorated, then that can create a vicious cycle, and we have seen cities fall into
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why I think it's important to try to focus on that kind of stuff, focus on the infrastructure, focus on making the experience good. Obviously, you need tax revenue for that. Tax revenue in New York has still been going up, so it's not like we're not yet in that place, but I do think it's very important to keep that in mind and to understand that cities have gone through periods like that, right? Even New York has recovered, but there have been some pretty nasty points in New York City's history. And so I think that it's just important to keep that in mind. But yeah, with that said, I think you and I are on the same page that we don't think that the millionaire problem is the number one problem facing New York City right now. And so, yeah, we appreciate that this report is coming out, but millionaires, there are lots of millionaire related problems, and I don't think this is one of them, or at least one of the ones that we should be focusing on right now. On that note, Nate, I'm going to enjoy the fact that I'm in New York right now and go enjoy this fantastic city.